Good afternoon. It is June 25th. It's a Saturday, and my name is Bill McCamley. I'm a state representative from Las Cruces, New Mexico, and this is your legislative update for the day. I'm sorry if there's some noise around me. I'm actually in an airport in Phoenix, coming back from Wichita, Kansas. I was at a meeting of a group called the Energy Council, which is a group of pretty conservative legislators and industry folks in the oil and gas industry. And there are three things that came about from the meeting this morning that I'd like to tell you about that I think are pertinent to your life. The first is water. I actually was the opener of a panel discussion on water and the use of efficiency and how we get the most out of our water resources. And I talked a lot about things like desalination, using water more efficiently at the agriculture, residential and commercial, and oil and gas production levels, and about the urgency that we need to address this issue. Praying for rain is not good water policy, and we really need to start dealing with these things now so that in the future, especially as where we come from, we live in a desert, the water situation gets worse, we are in a position to deal with it without being Armageddon. The guy that came after me was actually very good and talked about watershed protection, but he was from Kansas, and in New Mexico, watershed protection means protecting the forests on top of mountains. In Kansas, watershed protection means making sure that rivers, which lead to reservoirs, don't erode and put silt in all the reservoirs and then cause less space to be available in the reservoirs. I've never actually had this brought up in any of the conversations in New Mexico, but we do have reservoirs. So I'm actually going to be asking some of our state engineer folks and the other people that are interested in this issue how we're dealing with that here. The second thing got brought up was the Western Governors Association was talking about species preservation. This is a huge issue in many places in the West, and there's a conflict, right? You have species like the sage grouse or the lesser prairie chicken, which rely on certain habitats to stay alive. And you have farmers and ranchers and oil and gas people that want to use those habitats for money making and to make their lives. So how do we balance those is always a question. And the Governors Association came up with some recommendations. They want to have better programs where you get voluntary conservation measures by some of the industry people. So as an example, in North Dakota, some of the ranchers are actually planting sage grass so that this bird can live in there and trying to keep their herds around where the sage grass is. And that allows them to stop getting sued by environmental groups and by the federal government. They talked about using more conservation methods at a state and local level, and I asked specifically about this after his presentation, the representative, because here in New Mexico, we had an effort a couple of years ago to, for instance, with the Mexican wolf, to bring the administration of that program down to the state level. The problem is, the reason for that, and it came out during the meeting, is because the guy wanted to kill all the wolves. And that's not going to work for someone like me who thinks we have a responsibility to not kill everything around the world. And so he actually said that that sort of state and local intervention in these issues is good to have at the beginning of a process. So if you say, okay, we're starting to see animals get killed off a lot, how do we work on that at the beginning of the process to make sure that we don't get to the point where the Endangered Species Act becomes necessary? And I think that's right. The third thing that they talked about was earthquakes. So as many of you may heard, in places like Oklahoma and Kansas, where they use fracking a lot for oil and gas activities, the fracking itself doesn't cause earthquakes, but the re-injection of water, wastewater that's produced by the fracking process back into the earth has caused lots of earthquakes. In fact, in Kansas, they didn't really have any earthquakes until 2013. And by 2015, they had 150 of them. One of them was almost a 5.0 on the Richter scale, which is a pretty large earthquake, especially for the Midwest. So what did they start to do? They started to take action and said, all right, we have these areas of activity where we're going to stop putting all this water down there, we're going to lessen it. And they've tried it for a couple of years, and it seems to be working. And I think that's kind of funny because this is a very conservative group I was at, and they were talking about government regulation that actually had a good effect and using science to come up with answers to solutions. And the parallels there to climate change were fairly interesting because we have a situation where we probably should use some government regulation to help solve problems, and we should use science to get those answers. So I found that a fairly interesting comparison. Anyway, that is what happened today. And if you have questions, comments, or concerns, as always, on these or any of the other issues, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, and hope everyone has a great rest of your weekend. Bye.